This is going to be the lecture for chapter 6 on learning. We're going to first talk a little bit about how we learn, then we'll go into classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Then we'll talk about the relationship between biology, cognition, and learning, and then last talk a little bit about learning through observation. So first we're going to start talking about how do we learn. So how do we learn? Before we can get started in understanding how we learn, we first have to know what the meaning of learning is. Learning is the process of acquiring through experience new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. And we can do this a couple of different ways. The first way that we can do this is through associative learning. Associative learning is learning that certain events occur together. The events may be two stimuli or a response and its consequences. This process of learning through association is also called conditioning, which is how we get into, which leads us into classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So before we get into really understanding how those two things work, we are going to we need to define some terms. The first of these terms is a stimulus. A stimulus is any event or situation that evokes a response. This definition of stimulus is specific to learning. We have talked about different stimuli before, and they have relatively the same definition, but this one specifically is any event or situation that evokes a response in relation to learning. The next is respondent behavior. This is behavior that occurs as an automatic response to some stimulus. So a respondent behavior is automatic. If we hear a loud noise, we might flinch. So the loud noise would be the stimulus. Our flinching would be the respondent behavior. The next one is operant behavior, and that is behavior that operates on the environment, producing a consequence. So this is us, an example of this is when we use please when we request something and we are given that, when we open the door for someone and are rewarded with a thank you or something like that. The operant behavior is the behavior that is operating on the environment. It's the behavior that is impacting the environment around us. The last little part is to know is that conditioning is not, and associative learning is not the only type of learning. There's also cognitive learning, and this is the acquisition of mental information, whether by observing events, by watching others, or through language. This is more along the lines of looking at like learning material for school and that sort of thing. It's less behavior oriented and more based on the information that is being gathered. So those are the two primary ways that we learn: associative learning and cognitive learning. And we're going to go more into each of these. So under associative learning is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is the first that we're going to talk about, and the definition the book provides us for classical conditioning is a type of learning in which we link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. This can be a somewhat confusing definition, but we are going to look more into this. So Pavlov was the person who studied classical conditioning, and he developed how we understand classical conditioning today. For his studies, Pavlov used dogs and their digestive system. Pavlov was first known for his work with a dog and his studies of dogs' digestive system with his medical degree. But then he began to do different types of experiments, which led to classical conditioning. We know Pavlov as the person who did the experiments of ringing the bell and causing dogs to drool. So through his studies of dogs, their salivation habits, so they're drooling and they're eating, he was able to develop this approach to learning, which we now call classical conditioning. So there are 5 parts of classical conditioning that we really need to understand before we can really look at the how it works. So in doing this, let's start at the top and we'll go down. So the first is a neutral stimulus. In classical conditioning, the neutral stimulus is a stimulus that evokes no response before conditioning. So an example of the neutral stimulus in the dog, in the example with a dog is the bell ringing. This is a neutral stimulus that does not evoke a response by the dog prior to the conditioning. The unconditioned response in classical conditioning is an unlearned, naturally occurring response to an unconditioned stimulus. This would be the drooling of the dog. The unconditioned response would be drooling when presented with food. The unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers a response. So the unconditioned stimulus is the food presented to the dog, and the unconditioned response is the drooling. Okay? The conditioned response in classical conditioning is a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. This is the conditioned response is drooling, but the conditioned response is when the drooling is in response to the bell, which is the conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is an originally neutral stimulus, the bell, that after association with an unconditioned stimulus comes to trigger a conditioned response. So the conditioned stimulus is the tone, or is the bell, and the conditioned response is the drooling in response to the bell. The neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus as conditioning occurs. Okay. On page 168, there is a diagram at the bottom, figure 6.3, that has this labeled in with the example I just gave with Pavlov's dog, the bell, and the drooling. All right, so in his studies, Pavlov discovered and developed the major conditioning processes, and this had 5 steps: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. So the first is acquisition. In classical conditioning, acquisition is the initial stage when we link a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response. This is the point when Pavlov's dogs learned the link between the tone and the food. So acquisition is this this time when the subject learns that there is a link between the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, so the bell and the food. The next stage is extinction. Extinction in classical conditioning is the weekend of the conditioned response when an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a conditioned stimulus. So this extinction happens when there is repeated presentation of the conditioned stimulus. So with the dog example, there's repeated presentation of the bell, which evokes a conditioned response. So the dogs begin to drool when they hear the bell, but they never receive the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. As this happens, the conditioned response begins to weaken, and it does not happen as often. Spontaneous recovery is the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished conditioned response. So this spontaneous recovery suggested to Pavlov that the extinction was rather a suppression of the conditioned response rather than eliminating it, because it did have this spontaneous recovery where it would start happening again, even though there hasn't been a sudden reappearance of the unconditioned stimulus. So we see that it's important to continue with it's important that we continue when we're trying to condition someone, when we're trying to teach someone, when someone's trying to learn in this way, that the unconditioned stimulus is still presented. That way extinction doesn't occur. The fourth stage is generalization. In classical conditioning, generalization is the tendency after conditioning to respond to similarly to stimuli that resemble the conditioned stimulus. So this would be if the dogs start responding to anything that kind of resembled a bell, whether it be like a ringtone or like a note on a piano, something like that, they would respond similarly. They would begin to drool even though the stimuli that was present was not the conditioned stimulus. And the last stage is discrimination, which is the learned ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and similar stimuli that do not signal the unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned stimulus. So this is the being able to discriminate between the bell being rung and then like a ringtone of a phone. So that's kind of the approach that Pavlov began to understand through his work with the dogs, and using this to teach them different things. But what does that really mean for us in our lives today? This was something that Pavlov was really curious about, because it's good that we know what this is. It's good that we know that this is how we can learn things, but it's also important to know how to use this so that it's relevant to us and continues to be relevant to us. So we can see how these principles can influence us in a few different ways, but they can influence us, can influence our health and our well-being. And there's 3 kind of ways that the book outlines that this can be done. And it's medical treatments, drug cravings, and food cravings. So drugs, here's an example for medical treatments. Drugs given as cancer treatment can trigger nausea and vomiting, and patients may then develop classically conditioned nausea to the sights, sounds, and smells associated with the clinic. So this is one way that we can see that happening, where the symptoms of the drugs that are given become more associated with the surroundings rather than the drugs themselves. The next is drug cravings. Former drug users often feel a craving when they are again in the drug using context. They associate particular people or places with previous highs. Thus, drug counselors advise their clients to steer clear of people and settings that may trigger these cravings. So, using what we know of classical conditioning, we are able to guide people who are in recovery towards healthier settings so that they are not at risk of relapsing. The next is food cravings. So classical conditioning is kind of one of the reasons why dieting can be very difficult for some people. So we've been classically conditioned to when we ingest sugary substances, they evoke the sweet sensations. And so we are looking for those sugary substances in order to gain those sweet sensations again. And by doing that, it makes it more difficult for us to follow diets. So it's clear that we can use what Pavlov has taught us about classical conditioning in our daily lives. However, it is still something that it's one of the more understood areas of psychology. However, we are still developing ways that we can use it in helping people in their daily struggles. The other kind of conditioning that we're going to talk about is operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is a type of learning in which a behavior becomes more probable if followed by a reinforcer, or less probable if followed by a punisher. So there are a few things we need to know before we can really begin to talk about how we can use operant conditioning in our daily lives. So first we have to talk about the law of effect. The law of effect is Thorndike's principle that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and that behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. This might seem pretty straightforward and obvious, but this is something that that psychologists have spent a lot of time studying. So basically, this law of effect was the start of Skinner's experiments. Thorndike presented this principle, and then Skinner used that information to develop experiments that would reveal principles of behavior control. One of the ways that Skinner did this was through the operant chamber. And an operant chamber is a chamber containing a bar or key that an animal can manipulate in order to obtain a food or water reinforcer. Attached devices recorded the animal's rate of the bar pressing or key pecking to determine if they were learning and how quickly they were learning. This is also called a Skinner box because Skinner was the one who developed it. So the operant chamber used reinforcement as a tool for teaching behavior. In operant conditioning, reinforcement is any event that strengthens the behavior it follows. And so if a mouse was in the operant chamber and would press a button and food would be dispensed, then the food was the reinforcement for pressing that key, that bar, whatever it was, the button, the more often they pressed it, the more food they got. And so they learned that if they pressed the button, they would get food. So Skinner began to take what he was learning with his experiments within the Skinner box or the operant chamber and apply it to shaping behavior. Shaping is an operant conditioning procedure in which reinforcers guide actions closer and closer toward a desired behavior. So, one of the ways that we can do this is through successive approximations. So, if you think about when you train a dog, if you're wanting to teach them to sit, you would tell them to sit, and if they sat even just for a second, they would be rewarded. And as they got better at sitting, you would start requiring more and more of them, to the point where if you told them to sit, they would be expected to sit until you told them it was okay otherwise. And so this is successive approximations. You keep rewarding the behavior as it gets closer and closer to the response that you are really looking for, or the final desired behavior. This is an example of shaping in action. You can really see the use of operant conditioning in how we train animals today, and the reward systems we use for that. So there are different types of reinforcers. We're gonna talk about a few of them first, and then we'll get into more like, we're going to talk about reinforcement schedules and that sort of thing as well. So positive reinforcement is when we increase behavior by presenting a pleasurable stimulus, such as food. A positive reinforcer is anything that, when presented after a response, strengthens the response. So a positive reinforcer is when something is added to the situation that strengthens the response. Negative reinforcement is increasing behavior by stopping or reducing aversive stimuli, such as electric shock. A negative reinforcer is anything that, when removed after a response, strengthens the response. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. It is not giving someone a punishment. Negative reinforcement is when you are taking away something that someone doesn't like in order to strengthen a response that you are looking for. These both happen when someone or something does a behavior that you are looking for them to do. So negative reinforcement would be, I'm trying to think of one that's like doesn't sound awful. Negative reinforcement would be if you are asking someone to perform a certain task, and when they perform the task, you turn off the heater in the room because they're too hot. Something like that. You're taking something away so that their situation they're in is better, and it makes them want to continue the behavior. There are primary reinforcers. A primary reinforcer is an event that is innately reinforcing. It is often by satisfying a biological need. So this would be providing someone with food because they did something correctly. A conditioned reinforcer is an event that gains its reinforcing power through its link with a primary reinforcer. So this would be more along the lines of like a treat. When someone does something right, giving someone a piece of candy because they performed a behavior that you were looking for. Whereas the primary reinforcer would be just giving them the food that they need to survive. Okay. There are a couple different ways that we can one second. There are a couple different ways that we can provide reinforcement. There's immediate reinforcement and delayed reinforcement. Immediate reinforcement is reinforcement that occurs immediately after a behavior is performed. When the behavior is performed, you are automatically rewarded with it. When I was teaching elementary school and I needed a student to read to me for a minute in order to assess their reading abilities, if they read to me the whole time without any issues, they would immediately be given a sticker. That's immediate reinforcement. They get the reinforcer immediately. Delayed reinforcement is after a behavior is performed, reinforcement does not occur for some time, for some predetermined amount of time. Delayed reinforcement is kind of like when you receive a paycheck from work. You go to work every day, you perform the behaviors that are necessary, but you do not have, you are not rewarded for those behaviors and for a predetermined amount of time when your paycheck comes in the mail. So one thing when it comes to immediate and delayed reinforcement is if you delay the reinforcement, the behavior becomes stronger. The book states that the bottom line is it pays to delay. If you are delaying the reinforcement, people are going to continue to do that behavior until they get the reinforcement. And then they're going to continue the behavior in hopes of getting the reinforcement in the future. If you look on page 174 on table 6.1, there are little examples. There's both the description and an example of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. So just if you're looking for an example, that would be a good place to look. Now, when we are using reinforcement, there are a bunch of different ways we can do this, and there are different reinforcement schedules we can use. So a reinforcement schedule is a pattern that defines how often a desired response will be reinforced. So there are two ways that this can be done, either through continuous reinforcement or partial or intermittent reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is reinforcing a desired behavior every time that it occurs. So every time the behavior occurs, the reinforcer is given. Partial reinforcement is reinforcing a response only part of the time. This results in a slower acquisition of the skill or the behavior, but a much greater resistance to extinction than the continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement, if the reinforcers stop coming, the extinction will occur at a much faster rate, whereas partial reinforcement, if there's time in between when the reinforcers are given, it will take longer for the extinction to happen because it has not been known in the past when that reinforcer will happen. There are different schedules we can use when we think about reinforcement. This right here, these 4 types of reinforcement schedules are definitely something you're going to want to know for the exam. So let's talk about them. The first is a fixed ratio schedule, and this is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response only after a specified number of responses. So this would be me telling my students when I taught elementary school, if you are able to work quietly, no, that's not a good example. If you are able to walk quietly down the hall without me redirecting you 5 times in a row, then you'll get a reward. So after they've done that behavior 5 times, they get the reward. The next is a variable ratio schedule. This is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response after an unpredictable number of responses. So this is me telling my students that they are expected to walk quietly down the hall without me reminding them. And then if they do that, they may receive a reward in the future. And then rewarding that behavior after I've seen it after a number of times, but they do not know when that reward is coming, so it's unpredictable to them. The next is the fixed interval schedule, and this is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response only after a specified amount of time has elapsed. So again, with my elementary school example, this would be me telling my students that they are expected to work quietly for 5 minutes. If they are able to do this, they will receive a reward. The students know exactly how long they have to be quiet, and if they do that, they will receive the reward. And the next is the variable interval schedule, which is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response at unpredictable time intervals. So that's when you know that you're expected to do something, and it's expected to be continuous, but you don't know when the reward will be coming. So those are the 4 reinforcement schedules. Again, very important for you to know for the exam. So yeah. So if you are wanting an example or a table to look at for these four reinforcement schedules on page 175, table 6.2, there's a table for that that offers a good explanation of them. Now, also offers some examples for them that I did not go over. So definitely look at those. So we've talked a lot about reinforcement, but one of the things that reinforcement is often confused for is punishment. So we are going to talk briefly about punishment. Punishment is an event that decreases the behavior it follows. So punishment is something that is used a lot, used to be used more than it is, you could argue. So when we think about punishment, we've heard a lot about how, like, why punishment doesn't work, and psychologists have noted 5 major drawbacks to punishment, and we're going to go over them right now. So punished behavior is suppressed, it's not forgotten. This temporary state may negatively reinforce parents' punishing behaviors. So with reinforcement, you can see how the focus being on the positive behavior, reinforcing that positive behavior, means that the focus is put on the positive behavior by both the person learning it and the person teaching it. When we use punishment, the punished behavior is the focus. And so the punished behavior is not forgotten, it's simply suppressed in order to avoid the punishment. The next note is physical punishment does not replace unwanted behavior. Physical punishment may reduce or even eliminate unwanted behavior, but it does not provide direction for appropriate behavior. So if we simply are punishing someone or physically using physical punishment, we're not teaching them what the wanted behavior is. We're simply telling them that what they're doing is not right. It's not the behavior we want, but nowhere are we teaching them what the behavior we want is. The third one is punishment teaches discrimination among situations. In operant conditioning, discrimination occurs when we learn that some responses, but not others, will be reinforced. So, did the punishment effectively end the behavior, or did it just simply teach them where it is okay to use the behavior? Punishment is often seen as just teaching, especially with kids, teaching kids where it is okay to act in certain ways. If we punish a kid when they swear in the home, we are only teaching them that it's not okay to swear at home, and they'll continue to swear elsewhere. Punishment can teach fear. In operant conditioning, generalization occurs when our response to similar stimuli are also reinforced. So a punished child may associate fear not only with the undesirable behavior, but also with the person who delivered the punishment or the place it occurred. So this can teach the child to fear their punishing teacher, fear their parents, fear the school. So it's one of the things where, are we trying to teach them fear, or are we trying to teach them appropriate behavior? If we're trying to teach them fear, then punishment should be what we continue. If we should be teaching them appropriate behavior, then maybe reinforcement is more the way we should be going. And then the last one is physical punishment may increase aggression by modeling violence as a way to cope with problems. So we've talked about this, about how just because you were abused as a kid does not make you more likely to be an abuser growing up. However, physical punishment does model for us what aggression looks like. And it is shown that violence may be a way of coping with our problems. And so it does put us at a higher risk for that sort of behavior later on. We're going to talk in a little bit about why modeling behavior is important, and that it's because, we'll get to it, but one of the ways that we learn is through our observation of others. The important thing to remember is punishment tells us what not to do, while reinforcement tells us what to do. If we are trying to teach someone, it's going to be easier to teach them what to do than to just give them a list of things of what not to do. We never tell them what the expectation is. How are they ever going to be able to meet it? Most psychologists today favor an emphasis on reinforcement, not on punishment. So where does that leave us? How can we use this as a guide to learning in our everyday lives? Some might argue that it is easier to see how we can apply Skinner's work to our day-to-day lives than Pavlov's, but we're still going to go over it just the same. So where are some ways that we can see this? At school, we definitely can. I've given you plenty of examples of how I've used it in terms of behavior when I was an elementary school teacher, but we can also use it to teach like the information as well. We are able to use the information by tailoring the reinforcement to individual students, because one of the things that Skinner talked about was that the same type of reinforcement doesn't work for everybody, that sort of thing. We can also use it at work and school. One of the ways that we can do this is through frequency of when we're paid, bonuses, that sort of thing. Receiving either planned bonuses or unplanned bonuses can reinforce work behavior. One of the things that happens in sports still a lot is like more along the lines of punishment, in terms of you do something wrong, you run lines, that sort of thing. So that is one of the ways that we can maybe still work on applying what Skinner has taught us to that area of our lives. Parenting is a really obvious one for this one, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but one thing that is noted in the textbook is that we should be noticing when kids or students are doing something right and reaffirming that for them, instead of noticing when they do stuff wrong. Pointing out when they do things wrong isn't necessarily a bad thing, but pointing out when they do something right is really important. And then we can also use this to change our own behavior. The book offered 5 steps on how to do this. These are: state a realistic goal in measurable terms and announce it. Decide how, when, and where you will work toward your goal. Monitor how often you engaged in your desired behavior. Reinforce the desired behavior. And reduce the rewards gradually. Skinner taught us that reinforcement is one of the key motivators of learning, and so it's important for us to use that to our own advantage. But then it's also important to reduce the rewards gradually so that the behavior becomes more automatic. So how do classical conditioning and operant conditioning, how do they compare to each other? In the book on page 179, there's a really helpful table in this. I've copied it and put it on this slide as well. I would encourage you to take the time to look at it because we've already talked about all of this. I am not wanting to spend a lot of time going over it, but I did put it here so that it would be easy for you guys to find and look over. So, biology, cognition, and learning. So, we know that biology and cognition play a role in our day-to-day lives, right? It's something that we've talked about a lot, and so it's something that also is relevant in learning. And so this is not a table that is in the book, it's one that I've made for you, but we're going to go over it real quickly. So there are biological limits to conditioning, and the book separates it into the 2 different types of conditioning. So for classical conditioning is biological tendencies limit the types of stimuli and responses that can be easily associated. Biological influences put a limit to what is involuntary and automatic for us, which can make classical conditioning a little bit more difficult. In operant conditioning, animals more easily learn behaviors similar to their natural behaviors. Associations that are not naturally adaptive are not easily learned. And so this can make operant conditioning more difficult for some animals if they are not, if the behavior that they are learning is not similar to their natural behaviors, it is more difficult for operant conditioning to occur. The next area is cognitive influences. In classical conditioning, we know some of the cognitive influences on that are thoughts, perceptions, and expectations can weaken the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So this is kind of when thinking gets in the way of our involuntary and automatic responses. So when our thoughts and perceptions get in the way, it can weaken the association between what we are trying to teach, the conditioned stimulus, and what we already do, the unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, the cognitive influence is that animals may develop an expectation that a response will be reinforced or punished. If they begin to develop that expectation, it can impact their continued learning or their continued behavior if it is not being reinforced or punished in the way that they expect it to. And also latent learning may occur without reinforcement. We had not talked about latent learning up until this point, so it's important to note that latent learning is learning that is not apparent until there is an incentive to demonstrate it. If there is no incentive, then it is unlikely to occur. And I lied, I did not make this table for you guys. It is actually on page 182. So those are the biological and cognitive influences on conditioning. So conditioning is the main way we think of learning in terms of like psychology, but there is also another way that we learn. This is learning through observation. Observational learning is also known as social learning, and we have talked about social learning theory when we talked about social development in chapter 3. Observational learning is learning by observing others. This is done through modeling. Modeling is the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. There is a really well-known experiment that was done. It's called the Bobo doll experiment. So Bobo was a inflatable clown that had a weight on the bottom, and if it was knocked over, it would just bounce back up. And so kids would be asked to play with it, and they would play with it like they normally would. And then they would view a video of an adult who would hit the clown or pick up and throw the clown or lay on the clown or kick the clown and all this stuff. And once the children had viewed that, they then began to imitate it, and they would play with Bobo in that way. And up until that point, they had not. So this is them learning through observation. They observed this video, and now they're at the point where they acted in the way that they saw the adults acting. So that's observational learning. Another part of observational learning is mirror neurons. And this is an idea that a neuron that fires when we perform certain actions and when we observe others performing those actions. That's what mirror neurons are. It is the neural basis for imitation and observational learning. And so it's the idea that when we see something happening, when we see an action happening, a neuron will fire. And that is how we learn through observation. Mirror neurons are still something that a lot of studying is going into. However, it is something that certain groups of scientists believe. So, how do we see observational learning in everyday life? Well, we see this in two different ways. There's the pro-social effects and the antisocial effects. So pro-social effects have pro-social behavior, which is positive, constructive, helpful behavior. It's the opposite of antisocial behavior. Pro-social effects are when we see people acting in pro-social ways and we imitate those ways and we learn to act in those ways by imitating people that we agree with, that we think are good, that we want to be like them. This can we can see this in the way that we look up to people like Martin Luther King, like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, all those people that we see who have like done a lot to move humanity forward. They're the people that we kind of like try to embody. So there are some risks, however, because a lot of people, and especially parents, will say, do as I say, not as I do, which is really great in theory. However, if we believe in observational learning, we know that we learn more through observing others than listening to what they say, which results in these antisocial effects, which is the negative, unhelpful behavior. And so that's when we take what we see and model that and act like that. It's when we see aggressive things, violent things on films, on movies, on TV shows, stuff like that. And then we act out in those ways. And so observational learning can be very helpful, but it can also be difficult. It can be very unhelpful in teaching, using it as a teaching tool. So that's what learning is. So that's where we'll leave it. That was chapter 6. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or bring them to class, and we will talk about them on Monday.